We are going to be in Genesis chapter 15 this morning. Genesis chapter 15. Okay, I think I'm on there. Again, we are in Genesis chapter 15, starting in verse 1. Genesis chapter 15, verse 1 this morning. The past several weeks, maybe even the past few months, I've been focusing on a word called weep. Jesus asked the question, or it was first asked of Hagar, "What ails you?" At other times, people were instructed not to weep. Last week, we had finished a series where in Revelation 5, John was told, "Weep not, for the Lion of the tribe of Judah hath prevailed." Now I want to focus on a term, not just weep not, or why do you weep, but fear not. Fear not. Something I think is interesting about this is I'm planning to, whether we get through all of them or not, I don't know, but I'm planning to look at, first of all, Abraham, then his son Isaac, and then his grandson Jacob. And how God told them the importance of himself in their life. He'd say to Abraham, "I am your shield. I am your exceeding great reward." He would say to Isaac, "I am with you." He would say to Jacob, "I will go down with you into Egypt. I am there, even there, I am with you." We're going to look at the importance of God and that he makes all the difference. That's why these three generations could fear not. Something I think is interesting. In 1997, February of 97, I forget the exact date, I remember after a Wednesday evening service, although my grandfather wasn't feeling that well that night, right before Valentine's Day, he had come over that night, and after the service I was shooting. We had a cul-de-sac there at 55 Hampshire Road, and I was shooting a basketball there, and as my grandfather would always usually do, "Ryan, remember your follow-through." What that usually meant is don't just shoot it up. When you do it, make sure you follow through on that shot. And he given me instruction there, but he wasn't feeling that well that night. I didn't realize that's the last time I'd see my grandfather alive here on this earth. Later that night, early the next morning, he had a massive heart attack and never woke up again after that. I was 15 years old then. Jacob was 15 years old when his grandfather Abraham passed away. 15 years old. And yet Jacob at 15 years old had no idea where his life would take him. And at 15 years old, I had no idea where my life was taking me. If you'd have asked me at 15 years old what my plans were, I may have told you, probably back then, I still probably maybe wanted to go in Secret Service or CIA back then. Later on, it was to be a lawyer. My plans changed. I never had, in fact, not only did I not plan on going to the ministry or being a pastor, but I wanted God to be, I knew he was an important part. I knew he needed to be some part of my life. But I had him situated on some, okay, I've got this part of my life, and I've got to make time for God, and I've got this part. He was just a part of my life. I didn't realize that he needed to be all my life and the importance of him in my life. Jacob didn't either at 15 years old. But the same faith that Abraham would have, that God would encourage him with, the same faith that his father Isaac had, and none of these were perfect men. If I read my Bible correctly, or my interpretation of it, Abraham was probably more spiritual than Isaac was, just the way that I read it. But Isaac still trusted in God. God still, in fact, it really wasn't about Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. It's really this message this morning is about God's words to them, and each of them makes a choice, whether they're going to believe God or not. God, first of all, speaks to Abraham. And then many years later, he'll speak to Isaac. And then many years after that, he would speak to Jacob. After Abraham, after Isaac had already passed away. he'd again speak to Jacob. And he's the same God that he was with Abraham as he was with Isaac. You know, I think of it today. I don't know. When my grandfather was 40 years old, he was pastoring Meriden Hills Baptist Church in Meriden, Connecticut. I had no desire to be a pastor back then. No inkling that was even going to happen. But now that I think about it myself, thinking about being a pastor of a church, different place, but there's, no matter who's a pastor, no matter what size the congregation or the place, there is a similarity that all pastors do share. And I think about maybe things that he had gone through, and even that as a kid, I just knew him as my grandfather. I didn't know all the things that he dealt with in ministry. I really didn't find that out till later on, till after he passed away. He kept that to himself. He didn't talk about difficulties that he was facing in the ministry. He didn't talk about that with his grandkids. He was just Papa. That's who he was to me. And I think about how would he feel in this? What would maybe he do in this situation? But you know, the truth of the matter is, it's not about what a person would do, but about who his God was. That I'm sure that years ago in just a little town called Meriden, Connecticut, that whatever he was facing, God was up to the challenge with him. God is up to the challenge with me, and God is up to the challenge in your life, no matter what that may be. He is still God. And he still has the same words that we see with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can still be given to us today. We may not be in Canaan. We may not be in Egypt. Places may change, but God does not. Let's look at what he says in Genesis 15:1 to Abraham, called Abram here. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eleazar of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward heaven and tell the stars, or in other words, count the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. I want to focus on what God said to Abraham, but I'm just going to take a little bit further on about how Abraham believed the Lord first before I go any further. Abraham was looking up at the stars. And although probably he could see thousands maybe back then, we know there's countless more today. There's no way we know the number because we haven't counted them all. What we do know is that they're innumerable. And Abraham looked at those stars, and God said, So shall your seed, in other words, your descendants, so shall they be. Truth of the matter is, Abraham only had one promised son, and that was Isaac. Isaac had two children, two boys, Jacob and Esau, but only one of those would be in the promised seed. So now in that, not only Abraham, not only Isaac, but now in Jacob, we see that when Jacob was just that only promised seed there, still only one would have to be this multitude that would continue on. But yet God did that. Jacob did not only have one son, but he had 12 of them. In fact, it would be through all 12 of those sons that we would have what's called the tribes of Jacob, in other words, the tribes of Israel. And Israel is now scattered all throughout the world. And by the way, I don't even think they're anywhere close to what they will be in the millennial reign of Christ. I think it'll be an explosion of population, especially among the Jews then. But the point being is that from one came an innumerable amount of people. Abraham, before he ever saw that, said, It's not yet in my time, but I believe it. without even having a child. He believed God. Life is not about how great of a person we can make ourselves to be. It's about how great of a God God is. And do we believe him? Will we follow him with our heart, our soul, our strength, our might? Will we love him? In fact, I don't think we can love somebody unless we trust him. I think that's fair to say. We must trust God. We must love him. And I don't even know that when I think about obedience, I suppose it takes both trust and real love to really follow somebody through, like the Apostle Paul did, through stonings, shipwrecks, through everything that he went through. I look at what God told Abraham. Abraham trusted him. Abraham had a reason. This verse uses the name Abram before his name was changed. Abraham had a reason, for a human reason, for being scared. God wastes no words. When he says to Abraham, I am your shield, your exceeding great reward. In fact, that's probably all just one whole thing, one whole characteristic about God. We're breaking it into two here. But he says, I am your shield. Abraham had just, first of all, had just rescued his nephew Lot, had taken his groups of his servants and had rescued his nephew Lot out of the hands of the enemies. After that, he came back. And I suppose it would be easy for Abraham to maybe be scared about reprisal. After all, he and his servants, in order to rescue Lot, killed a number of men. Rightly so, but killed a number of them. Would it be easy? He's just sojourning in a land that's not his. What's going to happen in the next days? God says, I am your shield. God also says, I am your exceeding great reward. Abraham, after he got finished with that victory of rescuing Lot, there was all this spoil that came with that. The king of Sodom came to him and says, well, give us the people. Give us the people of our city. You take the spoil. You won the battle. That's yours. We understand that. But just give us the people back. Abraham said, no. Not only am I not just, I'm going to give you the people, but I'm not taking a thread or a shoe latch. I'm not taking anything of this spoil. Let some of the people that came with me take their portion. But I'm not going to take a thing of it. Lest they say that you made Abraham rich, that you made me rich. Abraham didn't take a thing of that spoil from that battle. So God said to Abraham after that, I am your shield. I am your exceeding great reward. In fact, the only thing that Abraham took is he gave a tithe. He gave a tenth of that to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, there, which is a priest of the Most High God. He took nothing for himself. Anything could he dedicated to God and gave to the others and then gave back again. So God said, Abraham, don't worry. Fear not. I am your shield. How can we make use of God as our shield? Well, I would say this way. The Bible says that we are to take the shield of faith. When we trust him, he becomes our shield. No doubt, no anything can really, it can try to make its way into our heart and soul, but it can if we're trusting in God. Things hurt. Things have pain. But when we lift up that shield of faith in God, God becomes our shield. It's no longer evil truly can't harm us there, no matter what happens. So God says to Abraham, fear not, I am thy shield. I am your exceeding great reward. What I want to focus on this statement is just that word, I. He says to Abraham, not just I am, but I. Abraham had looked at the battle. He had seen the treasures that he would not take, and rightfully so. But God said, now, Abraham, I want you to focus on me. When we think as Christians about what we're supposed to be, the Bible talks about a biblical separation. And that's what Abraham is learning right here. A biblical separation. Abraham, it wasn't about what was comfortable for him. He went out and went into the battle. And when he saw the spoil there, he separated from it. Said, I'm not going to take this. I'm not going to take what looks good to me, lest people say that you've made me rich. He separated from all that. The things of this world, he separated from, but that was only half of it. God says, now, Abraham, I am your shield. I am your exceeding great reward. I live a life of misery if what I'm focusing on is what I should not do or cannot do. I'm miserable. But if my eyes are focused on who is my exceeding great reward, who is my shield, it's not misery, it's joy. When I live a life of half separation of what I cannot do or should not do, or even just trying to measure up to somebody's standards, that's an awful burden to be under. Rather than, here's what the Bible says. And Lord, in order to do that, I have to trust you. I have to love you because I can't just separate from these things. Eventually I'll do them. Eventually, if I separate from this, I'll do something else that's just as bad or not worse, unless I'm focusing on the I. I am thy shield. I am your exceeding great reward. Abraham is learning a biblical separation because of that word, I. Fear not. I am your shield, your exceeding great reward. Now let's look at what he said to his son years later. Turn, if you would, to Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26, verse 23. Genesis 26, verse 23. By the way, just because my grandfather was a pastor, that doesn't make me a pastor, doesn't make me a Christian. It was my choice. It was a following of God to be a Christian. It was believing in him. And it was also trusting him to go into the ministry and eventually following him to be a pastor. Pastors and even Christianity is not given generation after generation. It must be chosen by that person. God has kids but no grandkids, has children but no grandchildren. It cannot just be automatically given. It must be taken upon. And I want you to know that when Isaac is journeying in this, God will say, he'll tell Isaac, I am the God of your fathers. But it's up to Isaac on whether he's going to worship God or not. It's his choice. Isaac was not like his father Abraham. It's possible, and probably is, that I'm a little harder on Isaac than I should be. I mean, there's a whole lot written about Abraham. There's a whole lot of, in my opinion, likable things that are more appealing to me about Abraham's character. And there's just a whole lot more written than there is Isaac. In fact, what the Bible writes about Isaac, there's a whole chapter that just does not show him in a good light. There's a couple chapters that do. In fact, there's probably more written about Isaac that's positive than negative, but in my eyes, I don't look at Isaac as the hero like Abraham. And honestly, I think in our life that could be a problem. It could be a problem if you look at the generations before us and say, well, I'm not like them. God doesn't call us to be an Adoniram Judson. He does not call us to be a D.L. Moody. He doesn't call us to be these Bible characters. Not Sarah, not Hannah, not Anna, not any of these people in the Bible. He does not tell us to be them. Paul even would say this in a way, follow me as I follow Christ. In other words, I'm just an example, but the focus is on Christ. Here's what I can say. When Jesus called Peter, that when he was there just fishing, Peter had known of Christ, but had not left his fishing nets. God said to him, I'm not calling you merely to profession. Jesus said this, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. God calls every person to himself. Not to just God doesn't call us to be a Christian. When we follow Christ, we will be a Christian. We're not converting to a Christianity, if you would. We're being a follower of Christ. And if we're following him, we will act as a Christian. I just want to mention that again. It's not about a religion, it's about Christ. God is going to appear to Isaac. And again, I think I'm probably too hard on Isaac. But he's certainly not who Abraham was. Isaac did not defeat a group of people and rescue a nephew. Isaac was not a person that was 100 years old when he had a child. He was 60, by the way. It was 20 years before he had a child. I probably took faith. And he did pray for his wife, Rebekah, so that she would have a child. That's certainly positive about Isaac. But outwardly speaking, he maybe wasn't I don't know that Abraham was a tough guy, but maybe he had more demonstrations of faith than Isaac did. Here's what Isaac's claim to fame was. He was this. He was a well digger. That's what he was. He was a well digger. He was known for going about and digging the wells, unstopping the wells that his father Abraham had dug. That's what he was known for. He didn't have to be a pastor, an evangelist, or missionary. God didn't call him to be that. I don't think God was displeased in the least that he was a well digger. He needed those wells. He needed it for future generations, and that's what he did. And I can say this, is that there are many people who dig wells today in the prayer for their loved ones in future generations that no one will know about but God himself. And someone will say, wow, it's amazing what God did in this situation. And we can say, well, it's because of this, this, and that. But there's a lone person that prayed in their prayer closet. That's the reason that God worked in that person's life. That's the reason. Because of a prayer closet. And I can say this, that digging wells, I'm putting it to like prayer. I can say this, that digging wells is not an outwardly, it doesn't look good on the outside. But it's what Isaac did, and it's what was needed. And I can say this, is that God would still work in Isaac's life. Look, if you would, at Genesis 26, verse 23, it says this. And he went up from thence to Beersheba. And the Lord appeared unto him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee and will bless thee and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. And he builded an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants digged a well. Now again, we're looking at what happened with Isaac, and I'm going to work a little bit backwards here. I'm going to look at what Isaac did and then get to what God actually said there in the beginning. Isaac was a well digger. But Isaac came to a place called Beersheba. And this was important. Beersheba was a place that his father Abraham had gone and made a covenant with Abimelech. And by the way, Isaac's going to make a covenant with the head of the Philistines here also. Here's what I do know, is that Isaac, he had gone through all these different places. Now he comes to a similar place, the same exact place, really, Beersheba, that his father Abraham came to. And Isaac's going to make a choice, whether he's going to worship God or not. I can say this, is that no matter what profession you're in, again, remember, Abraham and Isaac were different people. Father and son, different personality. I don't even think God wanted Isaac to do the same thing that Abraham did. It wasn't God's will for Isaac to wait till he was 100 years old to have one promised son. It wasn't God's will. In fact, he would have twins when he was 60. What I do know is this, is that no matter what God's will is, we will come to similar places. Do you know that even if it was Adoniram Judson in Burma, about 100 or so years ago, do you know that he came to a similar place that you and I will come to today? It might be a different place, it might be a different time. I think of Adoniram Judson after he had served for about, 6 years or so in Burma. And while he was there, he got so discouraged at everything that it seemed like no matter what he did, no matter what direction he would turn, it didn't matter what he did. It was always stopped. He tried this, it was stopped. He tried that again to try to teach the people. And boy, just over and over he had problems with it. They did not have a written language and dictionary back at that time. They'd write stuff out, but not really a dictionary on how to define what this is, like we have many of them here in English. So he'd have to get that down. And he'd learn their language and get that language down. And then he'd start working on, first of all, the New Testament of the Bible. It took him a long time through that. And he's discouraged at everything that he'd do and just constant things that he'd go through. And he buried his first child there in Burma. I think it was on the ship on the way to Burma. And I think about the things that he went through. You say, well, that was over there in that country. Well, I tell you what, there are other Christians that buried children ahead of them. May not be in Burma, but they know what Adoniram Judson went through. ad nauseam judgment. It may be a different place, but it's the same thing. There are times in our life where people not only have lost loved ones, lost jobs. There are times in our life where we look at and think, this is completely insane. I never expected this. Other people have to, different place, different part of the world, but the same Beersheba. And Isaac is coming to this place here. And Isaac has a choice. He can't be his father Abraham. And if you're going to try to be some Christian that was before us, you'll fail. Absolute failure you will come to. But if you say, I want to follow Christ, you can't be unsuccessful as a follower of Christ. As that song said, little is much, and as also as what Scripture said, which is more important. It's being faithful to God. Not just in a task, not just being busy, being faithful to God that makes the difference. Isaac is now told by God to fear not. Look, if you would, at verse 24. Again, it says this. And the Lord appeared unto him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. I want you to know here that God said to him, it's more than just if I was going to go the saying before, I would look at the word I. God said it's about me, I. Here I think the focus is on, I am with you. Well, but you are with my father Abraham. Yeah, I know I'm the God of your father Abraham, but I am with you. He didn't say, in fact, it wasn't even because of Isaac. It was because he says, I'm going to fulfill this promise because of Abraham, my servant's sake. There's a number of things that God does for us in our life, not because of who we are, because of the prayers of other believers. And do you know this? There is not a single thing in and of ourselves that God is pleased with. It's when he sees his Son in us that he's pleased with us. It's not about our righteousnesses. All our righteousnesses are what, y'all? They are filthy rags. But not God, not his Son. He's always pleased with his Son. So here's what I know this, is that there are plenty of things that's not for our sake. It's not that God doesn't love Isaac. He does. That's why he appeared to him. That's why he's speaking with him, saying, I am with you. But it doesn't have to be anything. He just tells him, fear not, for I am with thee. Isaac makes a choice now. He makes a choice on who he's going to worship. Now, I think he was a worshiper of God before that. I really do. I don't know how deeply. I'm not trying to be hard on Isaac. But I'm saying here he made a choice. To build not just, let me say it this way. He unstopped the wells that his father Abraham had dug before. Those wells had already been dug, and he started to dig them again and just go down deep again. But here, he did not take an altar that was already in existence and worship God. Look, if you would, in verse 25. It says, and he builded an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord. Isaac said, it's not just about what my father Abraham did. I'm going to build this. It was his choice. I want to look at one more, if you would. Turn, if you would, to Genesis chapter 46. We have the grandfather, Abraham. We have the son, Isaac, and then the grandson, Jacob. Genesis chapter 46, verse 1. By the way, grandfather, son, grandson, they're at another spot again. Jacob was a man that we don't know he was right around 130 years old at this point that I'm going to read. And right around 130 years old, when you think his life is done, he thought his life was done, by the way. Many years before this, when he was told his son Joseph had died, he said, that's it. I'm done. And then he said, they've taken away Simeon in Egypt. You're not going to take my other son Benjamin down. He said, finally, take him. And if I'm bereaved of him, I'm bereaved. He just, in his eyes, his life was over. But it wasn't. He heard that God was still working, and he heard that his son Joseph was still alive and ruler over all Egypt. And he was told, now come back, come into Egypt. And Jacob, I think unsure about what to do, where to go, how this is going to work out, starts his journey after finding out his son Joseph is alive, starts his journey to go back to Egypt. Let's look at where he winds up. Look, if you would, at Genesis 46:1. And Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. I just want to stop right there and say this. I'm so glad that he could say this. This is the God of my father Isaac. I don't think his Isaac was a perfect person. He certainly made mistakes. You can see them in the Bible. But God was his God. He could say, I know he was real with my parents. I know he was real with my grandparents. He's my God too. Look, if you would, at verse 2. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again, and Joseph shall put his hands upon thine eyes. And Jacob rose up from Beersheba. And the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father and their little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. I want to say this before I go any. I'm not planning to go any further in this passage. I just want to say this, is that Jacob didn't do the same thing that Isaac did. You notice there, in the one we read before, Isaac built an altar. Jacob did not. Was Jacob any less spiritual? I don't think so. I think here is that God told him, I want you to go down into Egypt, and I will be with you there. So what did Jacob do? I'm going to go down to Egypt. He left Beersheba. At one point, Isaac sojourned and stayed in Beersheba. Different people, different times. But again, it's all following God's command. And look at what God had said to him in verse 3 again. It says this, and he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt. I just want to focus on that part. He says, I will go down. First of all, again, fear not. That's used in all three of these. God's calling card, if you will. And then he says, I will there make of thee a great nation. Not just here, but if you're going to go all the way to Egypt, that's not out of my jurisdiction. God's king over all the earth. He's not on the throne here on earth. In heaven, not on an earthly throne today. The world does not operate according to what God wants today. Oh, God is He designs things according to his will, but what happens in this world, the decisions made by governments all over the world is not coming directly from God's authority. But I can say this, God's on the throne on heaven, not on earth here. But God knew what he was doing. And I can say this, is that God says that this is not outside of my jurisdiction. I'm going to be there in Egypt. He says, I'm going to go down with you. Not just anytime they were in Canaan or anytime they were specifically in the Jerusalem area. Anytime they leave Jerusalem, they would always go down somewhere. God always referred to Jerusalem and Zion. They'd be going up to it. Even though it wasn't the highest elevation in the area, it's nowhere near as close as any of the mountains that you would even go to here in America. But it was always going up to Jerusalem. There was something special about Jerusalem, the place that God chose. Even when he'd leave that promised land, not just Jerusalem, but that whole Canaan, that promised land, and go down into Egypt, even down there, God was there. God says, I will go down with you. That touches me, that he would be with Jacob, even in Egypt. It's a place that I don't think Jacob would have normally chosen to go, but that's where God wanted them. It was prophesied to be in that very place. In fact, we'd actually find out that it would be something that Jesus would go through. Jesus would have to go down to Egypt and then come out again. This was a much bigger picture that God would be bringing out here. You and I, by the way, we go down to Egypt. Egypt is, in the Bible, it's all the world has to offer. We live in a world like that today, where there's so many things to offer, so many things to take up our time, our energy, that means zilch when it comes to eternity. That's for all of us. Even as a pastor, I get paid to do things here at the church, but quite honestly, there's a whole lot of it that I can just do just for a job, and it's not for him. A pastor's position is no more spiritual, if you would, than any other layman's position. It's what we do for the Lord that makes the difference. And I can say this, is that with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God wanted them, not just to be focused on what they left. That's not the focus. But God said to Abraham, it's about me. I am your shield. I am your exceeding great reward. He said to Isaac, fear not, for I am with you. He said to Jacob, I will go down with you. And that makes a difference. Did Jacob probably want to go down to Egypt? He wanted to see Joseph, no doubt. But it's not Egypt that he wanted to go to. But God said, I will be with you. He was not done with Jacob. At 130 years old, Jacob thought his life was over with a long time before that. He would live another 17 years in Egypt. Before he died, he gave his final blessings and even prophetic blessings of his son. God was not done with him yet. Each and every one of these people had a choice. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Were they going to trust God, put their all upon God? They could. God told them to fear not, I will be with you. I am your shield, your exceeding great reward. I will go down with you. But now it's up to them to choose. Do I believe that God is who he says he is? Do you believe that? Because he is, whether or not we believe it.